I'm a little concerned about my voice being comprehensible because of the echoes. So if I seem like I'm speaking too slowly or strangely, indulge me, and we'll just see how it goes. When Chris asked me to be a speaker, he told me that the conference was going to concentrate on health and finance. And I had been writing about a feature of American life for many years, which I thought had tremendous implications for our physical and mental well-being. And that is the physical arrangement of life on the landscape, how we live. And I wrote several books about this, and I lectured about it for a number of years and traveled all around the country. And I haven't talked about it for quite a while, since we entered the age of the I'm not even sure what you'd call it, the long-running coup against our country. And I've been mostly writing about political stuff and writing fiction otherwise. But so I'm returning to a subject that is near and dear to my heart. I think it has a lot to say to us about our health, and especially our mental health. Before I really dive into this, I want to get through some sort of philosophical underpinnings and sort of basic psychological infrastructure so we can understand what follows. What's going on generally in our culture right now is that we are unable to construct a coherent consensus about what is happening. We cannot reach an agreement about what is reality. And as a result, we're having a very difficult time making any plans for what we're going to do about any of it, whether it is the cultural conflict or our energy conundrum or our debt problems or any large social, political, economic problems that we have. But I would say as a baseline way of understanding things, the one endeavor that we need to take ultra seriously is restoring a common culture in America. You know, and what has happened, and I think it accounts a lot for how liberalism went off the rails. I don't know about all you out there, but I'm a former Democrat. I was never a lefty. I was always a sort of centrist. I was never a lefty. But I think you can account for how liberalism really went off the rails. And one of the main contributing things to it was multiculturalism, which was basically, in my opinion, caused by the gross disappointment and shame over the failure of the civil rights crusade. By the 1980s, people were getting were feeling very unhappy about how that was working out. We had not been able to elevate the underclass. And so what we did was made a large cultural decision, which was, well, maybe we don't need to have one common culture. You know, having invited a group of disenfranchised people into our culture, and many of them saying, well, we're going to opt out. We made a decision to have a multicultural society. Now, unfortunately, what that means is you don't have an agreement about standards, values, and behavior. And that has been a signal failure of liberalism, and it has only gotten worse as the shame and embarrassment over the failure of all that goes forward. and we become more, we decide that there are more things that we don't need to agree about because we can't agree. We can't get that agreement. So one of the main, I think one of the main aspirations of the MAGA movement is to restore an American common culture, and naturally that is meeting with profound resistance by people who do not want to be or make or create or recreate an American common culture, an agreement about things, about behavior and values. That is why you're seeing the insanity of the American left. And I'll just leave that point there for the moment. One of the consequences of all that is that we have a divorce between truth and reality. And that doesn't work, because truth and reality have to be best friends if you're going to go forward with the human project. So we can't pretend anymore that truth is a relativistic thing and that reality cannot be agreed upon. And of course we have this phenomenon that was identified by Dr. Desmet in Belgium as mass formation psychosis, which is a product of all that. And we're seeing it raging through the land. Now, when I was thinking about matters of urban design, matters of how we inhabit the landscape of North America, my mind started to range through many of the psychological realms of why maybe we're doing the things that we're doing. And this was one of the ideas that I came up with, is that we have certain impediments to our thinking these days. And the first one is the installed belief, it's installed on our hard drives in our head, that when you wish upon a star, your dreams come true. And the problem with that is that it's a great idea for 7-year-olds, not such a good idea for adults. But it's there in much of the American culture and installed in our brains now. And it's accompanied by another debilitating idea, which is the idea that it's possible to get something for nothing. That's why gambling was made normative in the 1970s and 80s, because we decided, yeah, it's possible to get something for nothing, so let's make a big industry out of getting something for nothing. And I call that the marriage of bad ideas. When you combine the idea that when you wish upon a star, you can get anything that you want without any effort or without having to do anything. And that has become a form of paralysis for our country. And as a result, we end up in a culture in which really only one ethos applies. The idea that anything goes and nothing matters. Okay? And that really accounts for so much of the craziness and unhappiness and misery that we're seeing around our country. The master wish of all the wishes in the wishing upon a star, the master wish in America is basically, please God, can we drive to Walmart forever? And of course, we're not going to be able to drive to Walmart forever. So, that is a reality problem. Another consequence of all of this is that we have become, when anything goes and nothing matters, you become a nation devoted to racketeering. And racketeering has a very precise definition. Racketeering is attempting to make money dishonestly. And, I think we used to understand, when we had an intact, functioning common culture, that it was necessary to make money honestly, to be an upright citizen, to be an upright person economically, and to play your role in the economy honestly. But that's not true anymore. So we are now in an economy of pervasive racketeering, and this is one of the worst manifestations of it. In fact, it's very interesting that two of the endeavors in our American world that ought to be the most devoted to truth are the ones that have become the most dishonest: medicine and education. And the two endeavors that are now most damaged by racketeering. Needs no explanation. That's how we roll. So, Bobby Kennedy made a proffer to the U.S., to the people of the U.S. about a year or so ago, 2 years ago really. Part of his proffer was to make America healthy again. He was running for president, so it wasn't the only thing that he was seeking to do. But making America healthy again was a big part of it. And I think we can all agree that America appears to be very unhealthy. Unhealthy physically and unhealthy mentally. And we see it all around us in, manifesting in the bodies of the people that we see and in the thoughts that they express. This has been left out of the discussion so far as I can tell. And it is the everyday environment of America. And you cannot overstate how damaging this is to every aspect of being a human being. It's damaging economically, it's damaging developmentally for children, it's damaging ecologically, it's damaging spiritually, economically, in every way you can state. And especially in terms of our health, because these environments are punishing and ruinous to people. They are particularly punishing to your neurology. They make you feel terrible. And by making you feel terrible, they disorder your ability to function, to find your way in the world, to find your way in relations with other people, and in relations with your physical environment. When you go to a meeting, a planning meeting, let's say, of a planning board, to review some proposal for a new project being built in your town, we have these debates. And if you show a slide of something like that and you ask people, what's wrong with this? What's wrong with this picture? What do you think? Tell me what you think people generally say. Yeah?
There's no green.
There's no green. We're gonna get to that. Not enough apartments, not enough parking. Yeah. I'll tell you another thing they say. They say that it's all the same. Right? That's a common complaint. That's not exactly the problem. One of the reasons I wrote The Geography of Nowhere was because people were struggling to articulate what is going on with this. And it's not that it's just all the same. It's just that it's all the same miserable quality. It's all really, really bad. And I think you can summarize this in terms of physics, which is plays a major role in reality, by saying this landscape of everyday life that we live in our country is entropy made visible. And entropy is the thing in our world that drives everything towards death and stasis. And you don't want to mess with energy. You don't want to play games with energy. You don't want to go into the temptations with energy, with entropy. You want to stay as far away from entropy as you possibly can to keep on living and thriving in this world. So I wrote that book in 1993 to try to give Americans a coherent way of understanding what this was all about. We had embarked on this project to suburbanize America really beginning in the late 1920s, and for reasons that are pretty self-evident and are consistent with my general theory of history, which is that things happen because they seem like a good idea at the time. And suburbia seemed like a good idea at the time because we had this new thing called the motor car. We had at the time, the world's greatest energy supply. And we had an enormous continental-sized nation with a great deal of real estate that had not been developed. So we did this, and we embarked on this project. It got stalled in the 1930s and the 1940s when the war, so the Second World War happened. And then we resumed it with a vengeance after 1945, and we have never really stopped. We have additional problems. Let's say there is, in the new urbanist movement, which I became associated with after the publication of that book, there's a device for understanding how things are deployed on the landscape, and it's called the transect. The transect. And it's basically a continuum that goes from the most dense urban to the most rural wilderness and everything in between. The center of the city, the left, away from the center of the city, the edge of the city, the suburbs, the country towns, the farm, the wilderness. And at the one end of this transect is the city. And in America, we now have the big mega city, the metroplex city, the giant urban organism. And there's one fundamental problem with it right now, is that it has attained a scale of organization that is inconsistent with the energy and financial realities of the years that we're coming into, the future. And so something's going to happen with it. And what will probably happen with it is it's going to have to contract. Our cities are too big. They're going to contract. Many of them are going to contract away into nothing. And they're all going to contract, but they all are going to behave differently because they have very different characteristics. New York City, for example, is overwhelmed with megastructures. Whereas, many of the other metroplex cities like Atlanta or Houston, they have skyscrapers, but they only have, 20 or 30 of them. They don't have hundreds and hundreds of them. Basically, what we're going to see is an inability to carry on supporting the infrastructure of these places and the populations in them who have no livelihoods. And they're going to get smaller, and there will be battles over the parts of the city that have remaining value. And that may mean the waterfronts, the harbors, the old core districts that were where they were for a good reason. We have to understand that cities are where they are because they occupy important sites on the terrain. There are places in America, some of our cities are where they are for rather sketchy reasons. Denver is where it is because it basically was in a railhead. The river that it's on, which I think is the North Platte. Anybody from Colorado here? Is like a nothing river. So it's there because of the railroad. And, the railroads are not really a thing anymore. And when trucking disintegrates, I think Denver's going to be a troubled place. Some of the obvious other candidates are Phoenix and Tucson Las Vegas, et cetera, places that, are very poorly watered, places where you can't grow food, et cetera, et cetera. But, the great mega cities of the East, especially, are going to get smaller, and there will be fights over who gets to occupy whatever remains of their value. And that process is just beginning. It's sort of consistent with what you see in natural history, where organisms often attain their greatest scale at the end of their run. So you had the giant land mammals of Central Asia reached a certain point in their development, and then they're all gone fairly suddenly. One of the problems that we've seen really develop quickly because of the COVID-19 episode is the skyscraper quandary. And what happened, of course, is that when people stopped going to work, the companies realized that they didn't need as much office space in these skyscrapers, and the occupancy rate of the skyscrapers started to drop until, they were going to, at the height of this, or at the depth of this problem, there were maybe 20% of the people who were coming to work in these buildings. And it never really went back up to the level that it was at prior. And the trouble with this is you cannot run these buildings at 40% occupancy, because these buildings are all mortgaged. These are commercial real estate ventures. They're all mortgaged. They have to pay the taxes on the property. They have to pay for maintenance, for maintaining the systems in the property. And what you end up with very shortly is a commercial real estate disaster for megastructures. They're not easily retrofittable to apartments. For one reason, in an office tower, the plumbing stacks, there are only a couple of plumbing stacks, for the men's room and the women's room. And it's very difficult to rearrange the plumbing stacks in a skyscraper that's 60 stories high. So they don't lend themselves to retrofit. And we're seeing a process now where a lot of them are failing, but because of the games that we play with the law and banking and real estate finance, a lot of them are sitting out there being failed businesses, failed enterprises, and they're not being foreclosed on right now, but they will be. And that's going to be a huge disaster when it happens, because the occupancy is not going to be going back up. Other elements of our cities, which are obvious, is that many of them are full of terrible slums and dangerous places that are dangerous, places that are only lightly inhabited, places that appear to have no particular future at this point, kind of nebulous, ambiguous parts of town. And what they basically represent is declining value. And it remains to be seen if any value can be recovered from these places. Of course, that was Baltimore, which has been in a death spiral for decades. But San Francisco's death spiral only started about 15, 20 years ago, with this business. And of course, this was based on another social decision that we made in America in the 1970s. And that decision was that mental patients were an oppressed minority group, and they could no longer be confined in mental institutions. So we let them all out. And that was a very unfortunate decision. And I think probably a stupid decision. There are still a lot of wealthy people in most of our American cities, and in New York City in particular. But, there aren't that many hedge funders in America. and we can't all have a hedge fund, and we're not all going to live nicely in these cities. So, and as the trouble begins in the margins of these cities, with the poorer people and the worst neighborhoods, et cetera, they're sooner or later going to affect the people who are wealthy, who are living in the nice neighborhoods. Many of our cities, especially in the Midwest, have this problem, which is that the center of the city is absolutely dead. I met a woman from Dayton, Ohio, on a line. Is she here? That's you. Okay. Well, I think we had a 1-minute conversation about that. Okay. This is St. Louis, which is basically the same situation, but it's true all over. I mean, it's true in, Minneapolis, St. Louis, Cincinnati, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You go to these downtowns and there are no people there. They're dead. We have made really poor decisions about, how these buildings behave, even when we tried with a tremendous amount of investment to rehabilitate these city centers. We made very poor decisions that didn't work out. And so what is the fate of these big cities? Well, I guess I've already described that. It's not going to be the situation on the left. That's what we thought in 1964, that we were entering this George Jetson future of flying cars and, Disneyfied cities. But that didn't happen at all. History is a prankster, and history likes to play tricks on us, and it didn't work out. Okay, so those are the cities, and let's just summarize that. The cities are in trouble. The cities are especially in financial trouble, and people who live there now are going to have to think about making other arrangements, especially if they're already under stress there, if they're already having crime problems and problems getting along with antisocial people who live there. Country living is very nice, but increasingly, I think what happened with suburbia is that it blurred the line between what was the city and what was the country. We created this enormous ambiguous zone, bigger than any of the other zones on the transect. And that zone was a mishmash of the city and the country. It had all of the congestion of the city and none of the amenity of a city. And it has left Americans very confused about what the urban condition really is and what the rural condition really is. For a lot of people, the rural condition now is leading an urban life in the country. And part of the reason for that is that we have the internet and, you can supposedly work from home. That obviously has a lot of downsides to it, like, you no longer have real collegiality with real live human beings. But that's the basic recipe, is that the confusion over living an urban life in a rural setting. Going forward in the future, I think many of you would agree, if you're going to make a decision to live in the countryside, in a rural place, you better be prepared to lead a rural life. And that means having rural skills and performing rural activities like raising food, animals, and things like that. So we're going to have to get over that confusion. And so what we're left with mostly is the problem of this fiasco of suburbia. And this is a favorite old slide of mine. I've used it for many years. You see the smiley face here, right? Nobody's having a good time down here on the ground because of that. That's not Mr. Have a Nice Day. That is the visage of a wrathful God looking down on us saying, you're a wicked people and you're going to be punished. And I'm going to begin by making you live in this environment. And that's what it really represents. And so, when we do something like that, paint a smiley face on the water tower, the joke's on us. They renovated it 20 years later. So these are the environments that we live in. And one of the big problems politically with our current situation is exactly this. Suburbia is the favorite environment of MAGA. They love suburbia. To them, that's the American dream. And they haven't quite figured out what its shortcomings are and how much it contributes to the problems that we have in our country. So somehow the message is going to have to get across to MAGA that this is not as okay as they believe that it is. Now, I mentioned that I've been associated with the New Urbanist movement for the last 30 years. Really, they started in 1993. And it was a fabulous movement of some of the most intelligent people that I've encountered, since in my adulthood. And up until about, 10 years or so ago, they were going around very energetically and methodically building projects that people could see on the ground to demonstrate the advantages of the program that they were trying to sell, which was the walkable neighborhood, the denser American town, and mixed use. A very straightforward and not particularly complicated program. But unfortunately, it went against all of the rules and regulations of the planning boards and most of the methods and customs of the development industry. And it became a huge battle, which many of those battles were won, actually. Many of the new urbanist projects were permitted, and they went in the ground, and they became hugely successful. And in fact, one of the problems with the new urbanist movement was that their projects were so good that the market bid them up astronomically. So you get a project in the early days of the movement, let's say 1999 or something. You get a project in Maryland like the Kentlands project outside of Washington, where let's say the building lot started out at $30,000. Well, 10 years later, they're $1 million building lots. And then you get a stupid response from American liberalism, which is that the new urbanists are too elite. They complain as though these projects were originally supposed to be aimed at the United Auto Workers Union or something. Obviously they weren't. They were aimed at the middle class. But unfortunately, the market bid them up. The market recognized their excellence. And this is not an example of it, by the way. The market bid them up, and it became a huge problem. So, and then, starting about 2012 or so, the main organization of the New Urbanists, the Congress for the New Urbanism, got taken over by the early wokesters. And, after that, then it became completely woked up, with DEI bullshit. And they have just gotten themselves lost in the wilderness of DEI. And they haven't recovered from that. So that's been a huge problem. And they have made themselves a far less potent force in our culture. Back at the height of it, when I was there, really involved in it deeply in the 90s, they were constantly negotiating with HUD. They had changed the whole programming of HUD from building these sprawling urban, these sprawling poverty projects. And, they were negotiating with Henry Cisneros and with Andrew Cuomo before he became governor. He was the head of HUD. And now we're not having any conversation with any of the people in the government, and not with the MAGA people. So this is a problem. MAGA loves suburbia. Suburbia is unhealthy to the max. Everything about it, especially single-use zoning, is an enormous problem. And single-use zoning is a curse that arose at the beginning of the 20th century when industry was reaching such a scale and such a level of obnoxiousness that we decided we absolutely had to segregate it from all of the other stuff in our lives. And then we went even further because, we like to specialize so deeply in America. And we decided that we had to separate all uses absolutely. Everything had to be segregated from everything else. The residential neighborhoods had to be totally separate from the places where you worked, which had to be, the shopping places had to be in their own little module. The business parks had to be in their own little module, the office parks. And we disassembled the entire human habitat and put it out in the landscape in that way. And that, of course, ended up requiring everybody to drive around all the time, incessantly. You ended up with mandatory motoring for everybody, which creates obvious problems. But some of the, we don't even need to go into the traffic issue and then, all that. But there are a lot of hidden problems in this too. One of them is that children need to develop in this way by what used to be known as wayfinding for kids. Learning how to navigate through their own environment and get from one activity to the next on their own without the assistance of the family chauffeur. And that is now being lost. And what we're losing in the process is kids' ability to navigate around adulthood. They were never taught to navigate their way around childhood. Now they can't navigate their way around adulthood. So it's increasingly a problem. And of course, these are some of the institutions in our life. Which one's the school? It's a little hard to tell, isn't it? Because the one on the top looks like a school. But that is, in fact, the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. The one on the bottom is the Las Vegas Neighborhood School. And by the way, here's the green space. Because we're so mentally abstracted from what this problem really is that we don't understand any of this. We think if you put a juniper shrub down in the middle of a traffic median, that's green space. That's good enough. So what is the message that this building sends?
No value. No value.
Emotionally coldness.
Yeah. Flat.
Well,
Get you used to being in a prison.
Exactly. School is punishment. That's the message that comes from a place like this. All right, now, so then there's this other organism in our life, which is the American small town or even small city. There are a lot of them, tens of thousands of them across the landscape. A great many of them have lost their value. They've lost their economic value, or they have just been overbuilt with suburban crap to the degree that they no longer have even the physical form that they used to have. And but many of them are still out there, and they're sitting out there waiting to be reactivated, and they will. They will be. I think that one of the next places that you'll see where the action will be in America is going to be in the small towns of America. And they're going to represent tremendous real estate value for people who can get in there and, get a hold of, one building, two buildings, maybe more, and start rebuilding these towns from the ground up in anticipation of coming into a very different economy than the one we've been used to. Because the trends that we're facing are the end of giant organisms. Anything organized at the giant scale is probably going to fail going forward. It's one of the reasons that I don't get too upset about, all the paranoia about globalism and centralization and all that. I don't think it's going to happen. I think that the actual macro trend is so forcefully in the other direction that it's not worth worrying about, because we're going to go more local, and we're going to start downscaling many of the activities in everyday life. So these places have tremendous value. They're abandoned, but the bones are still there, and you can still revive them. The new urbanist movement was principally interested in allowing people to understand what was necessary in very simple terms to make a human habitat work properly. And at the center of it, as I said, was the walkable neighborhood and the walkable town. And these are photos of some of the projects that they produced in their time. And that one was in South Carolina, and that's just one street corner in that project. And that's another thing. Those are just houses, of course. They did all they could to build commercial centers in these new neighborhoods and new towns that they built. Sometimes they were defeated by the local planning boards who absolutely refused to let commercial activities happen in what they perceived to be only a residential neighborhood. But in many of these places, it did work. And many of these projects got built, and I think that they represent a way of understanding what our task is for arranging our everyday world as we go forward. Because these are the kinds of environments that will allow people to live close to where they work, that will allow a community to form of people who know the people they work with, who employ people around them at businesses that are scaled appropriately for the locality. And it's really an emergent and self-organizing organism that will allow human transactional behavior in the best possible way. And so the demonstration projects are up. What we need now is for this to become normative. I don't think that it's something that can be forced on the American people. I think it will happen emergently and probably in a fairly disorderly way as we enter a period of failure for suburbia, because suburbia is going to fail just as the cities at their scale will fail. It'll fail in a different way. The destiny of a lot of suburbs, they probably have three destinies: slums, salvage yards, and ruins. And, pick whatever combo you want. A lot of it will depend on exactly what the geographical amenities are, where they happen to be. And some places have some, and some places have none at all. So that will probably happen emergently as we enter a period of disorder and failure with the environments that we've created to live in. But expect it to happen, anticipate it happening. It's just that it won't be directed from the top down. A couple of notes about public space. One of the main characteristics of suburbia is the impoverishment of the public realm. It just barely exists. In suburbia, everything is privatized. Even the master bedroom has now become the master resort. It's like the master spa. You don't need to go out of it. You barely need to leave it to, supposedly enjoy everything in life. But in much of the rest of the world, there are public places and they enjoin people to gather, and they work wonderfully well. And you can describe why they work well. This is a square in Amsterdam, and it has the characteristics of an outdoor room. It's a comprehensible space. You feel like you're safe there. The automobiles and trucks are not going to come crashing down on you here. The architecture surrounding you, the walls of this outdoor room, present a coherent syntax of symbols from your own culture and history that you can understand, that also reflect something of your own humanness back to you. And there is a great deal of agreement about how things work in this, what has been until fairly recently, a European common culture. I'll give you a really strange example. Notice that all the chairs are the same. Okay, in America, what we would do, because we're so hung up on, individualism and originality, is that, one restaurant would have the redwood chairs, another restaurant would have the cast iron chairs, another one would have the plastic chairs, and then someone who was really trendy would have the Peter Eisenman punishment chairs with the carpet tacks on the seat. What they've all decided is that there's one kind of wicker chair that's really great. It's got a cushion on it, it's comfortable. We'll all get the same chair, and then we'll all be on an equal footing competing for customers with the same excellent chair. Okay, so all the chairs are the same, just like in America, in American suburbia, everything is all the same, but it's all the same miserable quality. With some lip service to diversity. So that's important. And what you end up is in an environment that people want to be in. And this is it on the really grand scale on the Piazza Navona in Rome, which was a repurposed circus that is a large arena for racing chariots. It's hundreds of yards long, and it's not that wide, and it's an enormous outdoor public room, and it has little roomettes all over the length of it. This is how we do public space. Okay? Notice what's missing. The public. This is the green space. These are the little UFOs that have landed. And here's the thing about green space. It's a completely bullshit term, and I urge you to stop using it. It's stupid, because it's an abstraction. And if you ask for an abstraction will be delivered. And we don't need abstractions. We need real public places that work. And the reason that this happened is because the architecture in our time has been so miserable, and the urban design with it so miserable, that people have no faith anymore. It's one of the institutions that's failed. People have no faith anymore that the architects and the urban planners can deliver anything that has any value for us. So the default solution to that is nature. Give us a green space. We don't want a building. We don't want a public square. We don't want some fucking sculpture of a giant Tootsie Roll. And that's why you get the outcomes that we get, like, with a tremendous urban renewal plan in Boston to get rid of the Southeast Expressway, and they couldn't agree on creating new blocks and streets with buildings on them, so they put up the Rose Kennedy green space. Completely stupid. The remedy for damaged and mutilated urban spaces is not green space, it's good buildings and good relationships between the buildings and the streets between them, and the open, squares and plazas between them. There's also, by the way, there's a whole nomenclature for public space that we don't even use. You ask for a green space. What do you want? You want a ball field? Do you want an Italian water garden? What exactly are you asking for? So don't ask for green spaces. When you go back to your planning board meeting, just delete that from your vocabulary. So, notice, where's the green space here? Just a couple of flower boxes, that's all. And yet, this is a place that people flock to, and they don't mind being packed in there like sardines. People actually like this. They like to be packed in with a group of people. This happens to be in Quebec City, by the way. Here's the other problem that the new urbanists have encountered, and it's a terrible, deadly problem, is that this idea of the 15-minute city has come up. And it has been promoted by the World Economic Forum, and people think that they now are completely confused about what is the new urbanism. Because the new urbanism promotes the idea that you should be able to walk through, the 5-minute walk to the place that you need to go to. But the 15-minute city is, that could mean a 15-minute drive, which is like 20 miles. It has no spatial context to it, and it's mostly a surveillance city, as we've all noticed. So, but the problem is that MAGA, I think MAGA rightfully is suspicious of all WEF stuff. And so they're suspicious of the 15-minute city, as they should be. But in the process, they've thrown the new urbanism into the garbage can. And you've got to go back to the new urbanist program and start looking at the retrieval. Go back to the dumpster, dive in, and retrieve those principles of urban design that they have been promoting for the last 30 years. And you'll be able to put together decent streets and public places in your own towns. So that's the big problem for the moment. MAGA loves suburbia. MAGA is addicted to suburbia, and they don't see any problem with it. It's the American way. They have, at the moment, no idea of what our petroleum problem is. They just think drill, baby, drill, everything's going to be fine. And, they confuse the 15-minute city with good urban design. So we need a better American dream than suburbia. And MAGA has got to be informed about this, including Bobby Kennedy. This has got to be part of his program, just as it was, it was installed in the government program in the 90s, and then it got deinstalled, and it needs to go back in. This is probably a plausible urban scale for the future for Western Civ going forward. And I think you can agree that these are very pleasant environments to live in, and they function very well. They're mixed use, and they don't overwhelm people or infrastructure or any of that. This is the American version. That was the European version. That's in Stockholm. And this is an American version. This is a small American city. This is Troy, New York. These are buildings that are almost completely abandoned, but they're sitting there waiting to be reactivated, waiting for reinvestment, and waiting for this scale of living to become normal again, and to become wonderful again, because it was once. This is the mall of tomorrow. The malls are now obviously and visibly dying all over America. That format for doing commerce is now dying and dead. But something else is going to be coming along, and I think it will be this. It will be the return of the real town, the genuine town. So that's it. By the way, this is a project by the great Leon Creer, who passed away about 2 months ago. He was one of the godfathers of the new urbanist movement, and he designed this neighborhood called Cayela in Guatemala, in the main city of Guatemala. And it was a beautiful neoclassical neighborhood that by some miracle got totally built and was immediately recognized as tremendously valuable. And there it is. You can see for yourself how beautiful it is. All new construction. So thank you for your attention. We have time for some questions and answers if you want, and if you don't want, you can go to the next thing. So thank you very much for listening.
As you were talking, Jim, I was formulating a question which you answered a lot of it at the very end of your presentation. Because 45 years ago, I spent a year postdocing in Oxford, at the University of Oxford, and it was this delightful, wonderful city that I could bike. I had no car in England for a year, and it was wonderful. And it would be what I would naively think was a wonderful 15-minute city. Now today I hear how they want to turn Oxford into a 15-minute city, and I go, what did they do to themselves in the last 45 years that makes them want to be a 15-minute city? And of course, because they were, but I also understand that this has, as you say, a lot to do with control and surveillance and not with quality of life and walkability and all the other things.
And notice that they have never, the 15-minute city people have never articulated any kind of actual design principles for the 15-minute cities. You know, whereas the new urbanists have a very sturdy and clear and coherent set of principles for how you construct and assemble a human environment that's worth caring about.
Actually, you're kind of answering the question I'm putting forth, which is, you know, what is this difference? Why do these globalists, you know, is there anything there other than control and trying to lock us down into some, you know, horrible situation? Since trying to make a suburban, your typical suburbia, a 15-minute city seems quite impossible and unlivable. So
Look, this is one of the major mysteries of these recent days of our times, is that we don't understand what their motivation is for any of this stuff that they're doing. The so-called globalists. What motivates them? We cannot figure it out. There are intelligent people all over the internet who are commenting on this day after day, and the one thing they can't figure out is, why are these people doing this? Why is Bill Gates doing what he's doing? Why is Soros doing what he's doing? Why is he inflicting this insanity on the United States? We haven't figured it out. But maybe it's time to stop trying to figure it out and just get rid of these fuckers.
thank you.
And I mean in a good way, like prison.
James here. I got two questions here. The first one is, can you comment on the whole Ponzi scheme that's happening in the urban environment, where you got cities, they build urban housing blocks, and when those new housing blocks come online, you know, they all got 30-year mortgages.
They all what?
30-year mortgages. So all that bank
You mean the
money-
condos or
No,
what?
housing. It could be condos.
Or single-family houses?
Yeah, single-family housing. It could be condos too. But so you have all this bank loan money comes in, and it builds out the infrastructure. So they got new sewers, new roads, new sidewalks, new houses, and they get plopped in, and then now you have all this tax revenue for the next 20 years. Well, you don't have any maintenance bills really due for about 20 years. But about 20 years later, all of a sudden now you gotta repair the roads, you gotta fix sewers, and the city then has all this maintenance. So the city looks at this going, oh, we need to keep building new housing divisions so we can keep getting that new money coming in.
Well, you're obviously describing a Ponzi scheme. It's as simple as that. But also, you know, we know beyond that there's a tremendous racketeering relationship between the banks, the mortgage originators, and the bonding authorities. So between the bonds, the banks, and the mortgages, you have just a huge racket. It's just more racketeering. And this is, you know, it has some features of a Ponzi scheme.
Okay, next question is so at the very end there, you had the slide with the nice, what is it, two-story residential on top, and then housing on the bottom.
No, I think...
Or no, businesses on the bottom.
Yeah, businesses, commercial on the bottom, and people living upstairs, which has been a normal way for people to live for 2,000 years.
Yeah, so I wondered, so I've heard that from a tax revenue and a density revenue, it works, you know, the usage of the land and the tax revenue that they get, that always beats everything else. Is that still the case? And are we starting to see more and more of that come across where
Look, there are many, many, many reasons to be suspicious about the real estate tax codes that we live with. There's a huge scandal that's brewing right now and a lot of it's coming out of Texas, if there are any Texans here. You know, a lot of that is happening in Texas now, where people's real estate taxes have doubled or tripled just in a year, because the school, it's gotten so expensive to cover the school bonding that the whole support system is failing. So that is another racket. The property tax racket is another thing that can't go on and will stop. Of course, the main inference you can make from that is that when some of these things stop, you're going to enter a period of some kind of disorder, some kind of disorderly thing that it will have a disordering effect on your society. You know, it'll be social, it'll be financial, it'll be, jobs and economy and activities, supply lines, everything. So, yeah, it'll be highly disruptive. It seemed like a good idea at the time. It's not anymore. You know what seemed like a good idea at the time? The centralized school districts. They seemed like a good idea in 1953. And now they have become creatures completely out of control, eating up the public's livelihoods. Okay? So things that can't go on, stop.
You talked about the smaller cities that haven't grown very much being a good place, and I tend to agree with that. But I think we're seeing where people from the coast, for example, who found their place unlivable, they're suddenly destroying mid-sized towns in Idaho by coming in, buying them up, turning them into their California-type suburbs.
Well, what you're seeing is exactly what I just said. When you introduce these perversities and racketeering operations and distortions of economic relations, whether it's taxing or financing and mortgaging, when you introduce perversities into those systems and turn them into rackets, you'll start to get strange social effects. And one of the social effects is that people are leaving one region of the country and moving to another region that hasn't suffered those perversities and distortions.
But they're bringing their distortions with them and destroying those cities.
Well, yes, possible. It's really all a picture of it's all part of one picture of disorder. So those are little vignettes of disorder that are occurring within the larger picture of a culture that is becoming increasingly disorderly in every way. You know, psychologically, socially, economically, financially, et cetera, et cetera.
On that last point, it seems like the people at the top of the food chain, the bankers that feast on that disorder, have for quite a while had the added benefit that when things fall apart, they get to recapture those properties at discount rates. People come in, BlackRock or whoever, and buy up things for pennies on the dollar because the people who initially put out the money and suffered through the beginning have to sell when they go bankrupt. So that I'm not sure that the system quite sees the failures you're talking about as being failures. They're just part of the continuing racket that they've had for a long time. And how that racket's going to die, I don't know, but like you say, it's going to die.
Well, there are a lot of complex points of failure in all of these rackets.
Mm-hmm. My original question I walked up here for was more of a comment that I agree with the problems you're citing, but there's a related one which is inherent in the culture. You talk about the wayfaring not working anymore. Well, part of that's the societal shift that says it's not safe for your kids to be out on their own. They aren't allowed to walk around and find their own way. It's not just the urban design or suburban design. It's the mentality of the people in the culture, the shift that we've had over the last 20, 30 years that...
Well, look, they're not entirely making this up. To a certain extent, they are perceiving real problems for their children in the environment. For one thing, there are, you cannot let children go play on a 6-laner. There are too many neighborhoods in America where the kids could venture out into the 6-laner and get crushed by a car. So that's understandable. There are also, when you empty out the mental hospitals in America because you want to take the principled stand that the mentally ill are an oppressed minority, then you're making a decision that's going to have consequences, which is you're going to fill up your society with mentally ill people on the loose who can do all kinds of weird things to children. So it's not a fantasy that the parents are having. that the children are not in a necessarily safe place. But, what follows then are, many more ideologically driven ideas about children and their relations with their parents and the children's relations with real life and adult life that follow that. So these things thunder through the relational environment of people. It's just not a surprise. And many of them are unanticipated problems and unanticipated consequences of decisions we've made before. You make that decision to run a 6-laner through your neighborhood, you're going to end up with parents who are afraid to let their kids out of the house. But that's the decision that you made when you were planning board. One thing I noticed, whenever you go to Europe, or when you go to Disneyland, I went to Disneyland a couple of times in order to write about it in a book. And, you see all these people from Minnesota and Tennessee and Wyoming going down Main Street, USA, and they just love it there. Some of them return every year. It's become a fetish. And then they go back to their homes and they destroy their own city and their own town, with 6-lane highways and, turning and putting a wilderness of parking lots where there used to be part of your town. And, it's hard to feel sorry for people who do that. It's a sort of stupidity that's it's hard to empathize with that.
On the assertion you made about MAGA loves suburbia, apart from the fact that MAGA is a very large, presumably diverse group, if we could say what they love or what they want to hearken back to, wouldn't that be more like, or would you think the good old days in people's minds are more like 40s and 50s small towns?
No, I don't know. I think, it's not everybody's the same, not every group's the same. But, if we're going to, first of all, our politics have taken on a kind of cartoonish aspect, like everything else in our lives, right? Everything in American life has become a cartoon. And so, our political ideologies are cartoonish. So, it may be simplistic to say that MAGA's favorite living environment is suburbia. Nonetheless, I say it's generally true. And it has been generally true of the Republican Party because, that is the laissez-faire party, and I understand that. But their ideology of the suburban American dream it derives from the fact that things happen because they seem like a good idea at the time. And suburbia is no longer a good idea in our time. And they cannot make that transition to understand that. So, the question is, how do you get them to understand that? Well, the New Urbanists had a fabulous program for persuading people. And they had a whole long list of people who are very good persuaders. They gave much better talks than I did about the particulars of the principles of urban design. So I don't know how we're going to persuade MAGA that they gotta start considering the defects of suburbia as a living arrangement. It's obviously a third rail. Like if you even start saying that, you're going to alienate a lot of Republicans. But I think it's a problem and it's a fact.
I know in a lot of your books you talk a lot about rivers being arteries of transportation and culture and supplies, railroads. So if we go to a situation where we have less petroleum, less 45 megajoule per kilogram liquid, and we go back to a world with less energy, what is our transportation hierarchy? How do you think that changes? Like we'll probably still have sail ships, and we'll probably still have boats, right? But back before oil, aviation wasn't a thing. So you think that maybe gliders or high efficiency airframes like that might be a little more attractive as forms of transportation?
I'd say categorically, anything based on increasing complexity, and especially technological complexity, is something that you ought to move away from. The most consequential thing we could do if we had any sense in this country would be to rebuild the passenger rail system. But because that's something that would really benefit the country in the long term. But we can't get a political consensus to do that. Not only do the politicians not want to do that, but the people don't want to do that. And the people have not been persuaded by anybody to do that. But it would be the most important project we could undertake, among other things, because the infrastructure is still out there and we just need to fix it. It has excellent chances of succeeding. And then if we succeed at that one rather large project, we could build our confidence to face other large projects that we need to face, like rebuilding agriculture in a way that doesn't poison the country and doesn't destroy the landscape or the soil. So I don't know if there is a technological answer to that. I wrote a 4-volume fantasy. Admittedly, it was a fantasy, about the future. It's called The World Made by Hand novels. And in that set of novels, the electric grid was no longer working. There were no more automobiles on the scene. People had returned to having to use horses both for getting around and for farming, and that their lives had become very, very reduced to their localities. Now, that was an extreme vision of a post-economic collapse future, admittedly, but there it is. So, yeah, I wouldn't look towards, electric cars or hydrogen fuel or, any of that stuff.
There's suburbia and there's super suburbia. I think it's gotten ultra specialized, where they've just separated out any kind of shopping and housing and so forth now and made things further and further apart. Because I grew up in suburbia on Long Island in the 60s, and we took our bikes everywhere.
Where was that, by the way?
New Hyde Park, Nassau County.
Yeah.
And took our bikes everywhere. There were little shopping centers. There weren't big highways close by that you're going to get run over by. We were all paper boys in my family growing up, all that kind of stuff. But today, and I was up in Dutchess County, New York for much of my life, and the kids were driven everywhere. And yes, it was a mixture of suburban and a little rural, but you didn't have this diversity in the neighborhood. So I think, that has changed to that extent. But again, I just did a drive back through the Northeast, through Massachusetts and Vermont, and I fell in love with all little towns, but they're all old people. There are not young people hanging out in these towns.
I know, I live in one of them. And I moved to Long Island with my parents in 1954 on the North Shore. Yeah, well, I was born quite a few years before you, on the North Shore, and we were the first housing development in that.
The North Shore? What was it?
Roslyn Heights.
I loved Roslyn. The Duck Pond was
Roslyn is a lovely old village. Roslyn itself was a lovely old village, but the hinterlands of that little town were bombed with development in the 1950s. I got there just before they destroyed it. I saw the last glimmers of what it used to be like, but I think the larger answer to your question is that history moves in cycles, and we did this thing in this peculiar period of history in the 20th century, where it seemed like a good idea at the time to develop all these automobile suburbs, and we did it. We made money doing it. It seemed to be a success, and all of a sudden we're entering a strange new frontier of the next chapter of the human project. And it's just not working out anymore. So, as Herb Stein said, things that can't go on, stop. They won't go on. So anyway, I guess that's about it. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for having me at this conference.